Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and for taking time out of your schedule, and for those words. Thank you very much. A good benediction. So the first panel will convene Betsy, under Betsy Fischer Martin's able direction. So we've got Jerrod and JoDee and Doug and Michael. And the first panel will be discussing the issues that defined the 2022 midterms. What were the primary issues and trends? Just a housekeeping matter, the first panel will run till about 2 o'clock, Betsy, and then we'll take a short break, and then there'll be a second panel starting at 2:15, and I think some sustenance magically arrives somewhere between those panels to keep us all going. So with that, I'll turn it over to Betsy and to introduce the topic and her panelists. Terrific.
Thank you. Okay. Jerrod Agen is the former Deputy Chief of Staff and Director of Communications for Vice President Mike Pence and Deputy Assistant to President Trump. So thank you, Jerrod, for being here with us. JoDee Winterof, who is currently the Senior Vice President for Policy and Political Affairs for the Human Rights Campaign. Thank you for being here, JoDee. Michael Steele, former RNC chairman, former lieutenant governor of Maryland. He was the RNC chair from 2009 to 2011 during the 2010 midterms. And in the middle, we have Doug Thornell, who is the partner and head of SKDK Political and worked on some campaigns this cycle, which we will talk about as well. So let me start with Chairman Steele. As I mentioned, you were the chairman during the 2010 midterms, which saw Republicans take over the House and pick up 6 seats, I think, in the Senate. Very successful midterm. As you look at this midterm, and the RNC is also famous for kind of doing the post-mortem autopsies, give us your sense of what worked, what didn't work in terms of the Republicans this cycle.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's great to be here with everyone. Excuse the froggy throat. So pretty much most of it didn't work, largely because I think there was a miscalculation and misunderstanding of the electorate. There was a lot of noise baked in around the idea that with an increase in inflation, certainly an increase in gas prices and things like that. Certainly the economic strains coming out of COVID, President Biden's approval rating, there was just an easy call to fall into the conventional wisdom that this cycle would be like every other cycle for the party in power, that they're going to lose seats in the House and Senate, and that it will set up very nicely a 2024 run. What was not calculated, I think, was voters.
Just a minor.
Just a minor detail, because voters still had to vote. And I think a lot of the narrative around how voters were responding to externalities politically were either misunderstood, ignored, or just outright wrong. I remember having a conversation with noted Democratic pollster Simon Rosenberg, who I've really grown very fond of and really happy to have sort of worked with on some of this analysis. And I remember going on air in the summer of this year saying that my calculation, looking at everything that I saw in 2010, that would give us 63 House seats, 800 state legislative races, 11 governorships, flipping 12 states from D to R. This was not that election. There was nothing that would indicate at any point in time that there was going to be a red wave after June 30th of this year. Why? Because June 30th, that was the end of the Supreme Court term, the Dobbs decision had been made, and the country responded massively. And for any self-respecting Republican, all they needed to do was look at Kansas and the election there, the ballot question on abortion there, to know we're no longer in Kansas, right? And that, so the dynamics politically had changed. There were pathways and glideways that Democrats, if they got out of their own way, because Democrats are famous for getting in their own way politically, if they got out of their own way and made the case, then they could survive this. And lo and behold, they pretty much have. Republicans, again, looked at this through some old lenses, saw it because the metrics told them that this was going to be a red wave election. But the truth and the reality of it is voters at the beginning of the summer, when 20 million viewers tuned in to watch the January 6th committee hearings and stayed with that narrative, it was very interesting and very telling to see at the beginning of the summer where democracy was like number 7, 8, or 9 on the voters' hit parade of priorities. The weekend before the election, it was the number 1 issue for voters. So the signs were there that this was not going to be the kind of election that Republicans thought it would be at the beginning of the summer. And sure enough, we're now looking at, right now, I think the number is something like 211 Republican seats, 204, unless that's been updated in the last 24 hours, 50 seats in the Senate for Democrats, likely the Georgia race, particularly if Trump announces his plans tomorrow, God help us, then that's going to further shift the political dynamics on the back end of this election cycle. And Republicans right now who are doing a lot of soul searching and a lot of breastfeeding and a lot of blame gaming really don't have to look at anyone other than themselves, because the metrics were off, but the voters weren't. And the voters were telling folks for a long time what their trend lines were going to be. And you could be on the right side of that, but they chose not to be. They wanted to push this particular red wave narrative when it just wasn't setting up to be that.
Jerrod, let me ask you for any rebuttal on that. Have you been doing any soul searching, and what have you found?
I should. I think I've decided to move to Florida. That's the soul searching. No, I mean, Michael's right on a lot of subjects, and I do think, you know, the topics that I think elections and the way people vote has fundamentally changed a lot the last couple of cycles, particularly, you know, people voting a lot earlier. And so I do think that a lot of this red wave narrative and a lot of the polling that was pushed out in the final weeks and the shifting really was, you know, this kind of false hope of I do think a lot of voters had already decided.
Or spin, one of the two.
Yeah, I mean, but I mean, there's, I think, fundamentally two issues that shaped it, being Dobbs and abortion, and then the candidate quality.
Yeah.
And those things, I think there was, you know, this hope that oh, this narrative and this shift towards inflation and the economy and crime, which some people focused on and were successful with, but I think it was baked in late summer, early fall, and a lot of these candidates that were not good candidates didn't get their ads up on the air, didn't get their message out, and so when we talk about flawed candidates, and we'll dive a lot into this, but it's not just they didn't accept the election results. That is one thing that makes you a flawed candidate, but that's not the only thing. You know, people got through primaries on the Republican side because they got a single endorsement, and they did not have the infrastructure. You know, they didn't have the donor base, they didn't have the volunteers, they hadn't done media interviews. You know, they're all the things that kind of train you at what a primary is supposed to be for, to get you in a position to take on a difficult person on the other side. in the general election, that work wasn't done. And so, you had a lot of candidates in governor's races and Senate races where, they were, the voters had already turned on them before they, they even got their ads up and things like that. And so, the exceptions to that being, a place like Florida, a place like New York, where I do think, the Republicans overperformed, particularly in New York, where New York being what it is, abortion wasn't necessarily on the table because it wasn't going to be. And so, Lee Zeldin and the candidates for the House seats there were able to just focus on crime and inflation, and you saw success there. And you look at kind of the upper Midwest or whatever, Michigan, Pennsylvania, that's the opposite. Michigan in particular, abortion was the driving narrative, and you saw technically a blue wave in Michigan. So anyways, I think would have been nice to see a red wave. However, it's a lot more complicated, I think, now, and a lot more to dive into on both sides to see what worked and what didn't work.
Thanks, Jerrod. JoDee, let me bring you in. We mentioned abortion, a Dobbs decision, and that being a motivating factor. What are your thoughts on that, and how did you see that play in the major campaigns this cycle?
There we go. So I think Dobbs is very important in part because for a long time, Democrats have been saying they're coming for your rights, right? So that was obviously, today's here. And so I do think it was a very defining moment. And the work I do in the LGBTQ community, obviously there's also concern around keeping marriage equality, which is, a right that some states have passed and went through the courts as well. And so, there's nervousness. I don't think that the courts would roll that back, but would more states? Absolutely. And so therefore, working to pass marriage equality would be important to do when we come back in lame duck. But, I'm interested in what's being shared here. I also think that Democrats had not as hard of a path as we all felt as you look back on it. It's always easier to sit here after an election and tell folks what you think. I was a nervous wreck around this election, and I'm usually a person who can keep it pretty steady. I'm a German Midwesterner, and so, and I'm hardy because I grew up in Western Iowa, which is the very Republican part, born in Steve King's old congressional district, and then I got to get married in that same district later to a woman, which was just spectacular, but I digress. So, as I think about what transpired here, I certainly think that the Dobbs decision was motivational. And one of the things we saw in this election, a couple things we saw, obviously, were all the single ladies, like the single women, came out in force, and also youth. And so there are some stats that are coming out now, I think Wisconsin, where they were calculating almost 350% over 2018. But the other thing I want to share too, and I think it was you, Jerrod, who said some of this was baked in the summer. And I do think that's true, and I also think that some of the folks who probably have in the past voted for Trump and had that anger and had that frustration, we're also looking at this as a different election. And I do think we have to take a look at that. This was about turnout, but a few of those folks in some races, it looks as though they made a different decision. And so I think that's going to be important for us to look at too as we head into the presidential cycle. But there wasn't much about this cycle that felt normal. And so, Chairman, I think some of your comments about it wasn't the same. It's not the same. And what I would argue, what I've seen in the last while, is that, we have 3/4 of the country supporting LGBTQ equality. So that isn't a Democratic issue. That's the general population issue, right? And so the ground has shifted. What I observed is that folks were running their primary campaigns, and they kept doing that in some of the general elections. And so being on the wrong side of abortion, being on the wrong side, as I would say, of equality, doing those anti-trans horrible ads that they were doing, that was like, what playbook are you using to win? Who's going to vote for you in the end? You have to get, to your victory number. And I couldn't see how they were going to do that.
There was a lot of campaigning against something. Right. I mean, I had teach a course on the midterms at American University and took students to Philadelphia for 5 days around the election and went to all the different rallies, and we went to a couple of Mastriano rallies, and every other word from the podium was transgender. That was it. And maybe a couple gas prices in between, right? And so that point you made there, I think, resonates. Doug, let me ask you, as you look at this and think about lessons learned, what worked effectively, you were working a lot on the Maryland governor's race with Wes Moore. Give us your thoughts.
Well, first of all, it's great to be on this panel, and great to be back in Greece. Look, Democrats ran better campaigns this cycle, plain and simple. We took this seriously. We knew that we knew our history. A lot of us who were running or part of these campaigns had been around in 2010 and 2008 and had seen and had been part of these wave elections on either side. Gary Peters, who runs the DSCC, was in the House, during 2010 and during and Sean Maloney, who ran the DCCC, did the autopsy after, after I think 2020. So there was a lot of built-in fear already on our side, and we ran as if we were 10 points down from the start of this campaign. And so what does that mean? So that means that Mark Kelly in Arizona started running his advertisements in, I think, March. We started, and it was all positive. We started doing, defining Mark as a independent, bipartisan problem solver in Arizona. Over and over again, those ads hit on those things. That same thing in Kansas, where my firm did Laura Kelly. Very much getting out ahead of where Republicans and outside groups were in terms of trying to define our candidates early. And then when we knew who the opponent was, we went after them very quickly and very aggressively. And whether that was around the issue of choice, or whether that was around privatizing Social Security, or in some cases, like in Kansas, it was returning to a Sam Brownback economy. Whatever the issue was, we were relentless. And I think my partner at the firm, a few days before the election, he said to me, he was like, it would be a shame if we lost these races, because it would tell me that candidates and campaigns don't matter anymore. And so they do. Candidates matter, campaigns matter. I think to Jerrod's point, if you look at 2022, the Republicans made a lot of mistakes that cost them races, and it cost them making races actually more competitive than they could have been. And look, like Maryland, as our home state Chairman Steele, it's possible that Larry Hogan could have run against Chris Van Hollen. That would have been a highly competitive race. It would have forced Democrats to spend money in a very costly market. Hogan didn't run because he probably saw some stuff that Mr. Steele saw, right? Like that this may not be that great of an environment. Doug Ducey didn't run in Arizona. In New Hampshire, John Sununu didn't run. And so in all of those places, what happened? The three people who ended up running were these extremists, and Dan Cox got blown out, and Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire blew her opponent out. And in Arizona, it was a very complicated and hard race, but at the end of the day, Mark's going to win with a very sizable margin. And you could look at Mastriano and Oz in Pennsylvania. You can look at, Herschel Walker in Georgia. They nominated bad, in my opinion, bad candidates, and their candidates didn't run good campaigns. And I would also say my last point on this is that we got, while at the outside group level, there was a ton of money going after Democrats. At the candidate level, they really did not do a good job of fundraising. There was a point in time where J.D. Vance and Blake Masters really weren't even advertising for a little while because they didn't have resources, or they were doing a very minimal amount. And so outside groups came in, but outside groups pay a lot more for their television points than candidates do. And so that means that their money is, candidates' money goes further on TV, and you can also control the message better. And so we were, in all of these competitive Senate races, I think the key thing is that we took it seriously early. We got out there early. We defined our candidates early, and we defined them early. And I think that made a huge, huge difference. And, candidates and campaigns matter. And I'm glad, because I was a little worried that maybe this cycle would say, well, no matter what kind of campaigns you run or the candidates you run, at the end of the day, it's just going to be, you're going to get drowned by this red wave. But that didn't happen. And so, I think it's a good sign for political practitioners who do this for a living that it does actually matter. And to Michael's point and everyone else's point, voters, you still got to wait for voters to weigh in,
Jerrod, let me ask you, we saw Trump pointing the fingers at Melania for Oz, but when we talk about the candidate quality component, how much impact or responsibility does the former president have in that process in terms of recruiting candidates and then his endorsement of particular candidates in the primaries as well?
Certainly this cycle, Trump has an outsized role, more than I would say any, politician has ever had.
Yeah.
And certainly in the Republican primary, obviously. And there's a whole cottage industry around securing you Donald Trump's endorsement. And I think, and as you get close to these races and candidates, the primary strategy isn't, we're going to do this many door knocks, or I'm going to meet with this many donors. It's how do I secure that endorsement, because that is how I'm going to get through the primary. And I do think, one of the things that needs to be focused on, and I think when you look at who succeeded, like a Brian Kemp or DeSantis, Mike DeWine, it used to be, certainly in Republican circles, the business, building those relationships with business leaders, business donors was a huge component. And so the part that I was kind of nervous about even going in was getting the feedback that, it's a leading indicator when they're not raising money, these candidates. But when you hear from behind the scenes of donors who give to Trump, or business leaders who's generally weigh in on these campaigns, they're not investing. And so if you're running an election about the economy and jobs and things like that, normally what the kind of messaging is, but you don't have the local business leaders out there behind you. And so what I heard a lot, which was probably the most nervous part, is a lot of these candidates just weren't sealing the deal behind the scenes with these business leaders. And I think that as you look to future elections, that is that's something that fundamentally has to change with these candidates. It cannot just be, how do I get this one endorsement? It's more, how do I build this coalition?
Right. It's not the Chamber of Commerce election anymore.
Well, it became anti-chamber.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on a significant, important point Jerrod just made. It was stunning to me to watch the GOP become basically anti-business. And I was like, I don't know how that works, because this is where I come from, is bread and butter. So you're absolutely right. It's just the reason you didn't have business leaders behind those candidates, because those business leaders didn't find that connection. They weren't reached out to, and to the extent that they were, you saw play out in places like Florida with DeSantis, sort of this anti-corporate mindset, and these companies getting caught up in the world of wokeism versus non-wokeism. And, you know, anyone who knows business leaders, they're bottom line people. They're like, you know, this is, I just want to know my taxes going up, if, you know, et cetera. So there were a lot of dynamics that sort of played narratively into how Republican candidates responded. And you knew you were in a bad place the day that McConnell came out with his candidate quality statement. He'd had enough. He looked around and he saw these candidates. He said, there's no way in hell we're going to win with this lot. So, you know, you're trying to make, you know, something out of the Swiss cheese you've been given. And you're seeing all these holes in the political narrative. You're seeing the holes in the economic narrative because they're not raising money. You know, everybody is sort of clamoring and falling all over themselves for Trump's endorsement. Meanwhile, you've got Republican leaders who are in races like Kemp and DeWine, who've just basically walled themselves off from the crazy and ran their statewide races for governor accordingly, and did almost, if you will, sort of traditional Republican campaigning, and were successful in that. And so there are a lot of seeds, obviously, that will germinate something over the next two or three cycles for the GOP. But there are also elements of sort of the things that still work for Republicans if they, you know, can narratively go out and talk about core values and principles, tie that to their public policy, and bring voters into the conversation. That's not what the Trump piece offered these candidates, because I look at Dan Cox in Maryland. You know, there's a reason why Governor Hogan came out and said, there's no way in hell I'm supporting this crackpot. Literally, that's his quote about our gubernatorial nominee. And it's when you're in that space, you're not gaining any ground, you're not winning any friends, you're not advancing the ball. And so the real challenge for the party going forward is going to be, how do we cleanse ourselves of that and return to those narratives that allow us to engage competitively with Democrats along policy lines, instead of, you know, having every Republican candidate get whipped upside the head with some Trumpism thing that Trump said or did. And if you are lucky enough, like a DeWine and others, to sort of create that separation, you know, sort of do the Heisman that Youngkin did in Virginia, for example, you can do that. But I think after this election, that's going to be harder to do, because as we've known since, 1996, after every successive loss in races, whether it's, you know, 96 and 2008 and 2006, Republicans double down. And they say, oh, we weren't conservative enough. Oh, we weren't this enough. We didn't do that enough. And so it's going to be hard to sort of pull back those reins on some of this. I think you're trying to see some of the leadership do it now, but good luck with that.
Well, and I think too, when we saw in the Virginia governor's race last year, we mentioned Youngkin, when he was dealing with the Trump issue, right? It was like, Trump did not come and do any events. Part of that success was managing the Trump factor and sort of keeping him at arm's distance, but not pissing him off, right? Because then you can pay a price. Doug, let me ask you about the Trump factor and the fact that, you know, maybe he's not necessarily the power broker that we thought he was.
I think within the Republican Party, he definitely is. I mean, if you look at the people that won primaries, Blake Masters, J.D. Vance, Mastriano, Dr. Oz, these are all Trump-endorsed candidates. So within the party, I mean, let's be clear, it's Trump's party right now. I mean, he's, you know, if you get his endorsement, you're likely to win a primary. And now, in the general, it's a totally different story. And, you know, I think some of these Republicans had a hard time centering themselves. One of the things that I always tell my clients is that I want to be able to run our introductory ad or introductory launch video at the end of the campaign, at the very end. So if you're running I told that to Wes, I said, look, we want to be able to run this launch video that we started in the primary at the end, right? Because that tells you that you're being consistent with your message, and you're being authentic, and you're not veering around. And so what you say in the primary is what you say in the general. There are some exceptions in terms of issues you may talk more about, but I think what you saw in the races that the Democrats ran, the ad that launched their campaign, they could run at the end. And for Republicans, they can't do that because they're trying to win a primary, and they're appealing to a more not even conservative, it's very extreme part of the party that expects you to talk about CRT all the time and talk about these issues that, quite frankly, most voters aren't really caring about, where a person can go to the bathroom and these are things that, but in primary, and how much Joe Biden sucks, right? Like how many times can you say Joe Biden's bad, right? But when you get to the general, it's really hard to center yourself back in the middle, and I think you saw that in Arizona. I think you saw that. Look, J.D. Vance should have walked away with that campaign, and the fact that Republicans had to spend millions and millions of dollars there was a problem because it was money that they couldn't spend elsewhere. And so Pennsylvania, you saw the same thing. The Republicans they made themselves toxic to swing voters, and that was I think a big factor of them trying to get the Trump endorsement. They got it, and then it was great for the primary, but at the end of the day, it hurt them in the general.
Yeah, when we think about Pennsylvania as well, I mean, did the Fetterman win there? Did that show the party how to court and win, not totally, but loosen up the margins for white working class voters?
Yeah, you go and talk to them.
Yeah, what a concept, right?
We did that in Maryland with Wes.
Yeah.
And he told this story about when I was leading men in combat, I never asked them what party they were affiliated with, right? And so look, Democrats need to be more aggressive in terms of courting rural voters and voters in towns.
Mm-hmm.
I think from a policy standpoint, for what we have to say on healthcare and economic issues, I think it will resonate with them. But if they think that you hate them and despise them and look down on them,
yeah,
they're not going to vote for you. So I think we have to have candidates like Mark Kelly and like Laura Kelly and like Wes and like Fetterman who, actually, they look at all of the voters and see value in all of them, and it's not just how do I get to 50.1.
Right.
It's how do I build out an electorate that is going to make it so I can not be sweating on election day because you're campaigning in red parts of the state and blue parts, and so it's really important you go and talk to those voters, and I think you saw that more and more with a lot of our winning candidates, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania. We won a couple seats in Ohio, House seats in Michigan, and the same thing in Pennsylvania, because we went, because those candidates, and they went to those parts of the state and talked to voters.
Yeah, JoDee, how important is that, especially when you think about fractures within the Democratic Party, the more progressive wing, the influence that they have, and candidates that need to moderate and be more in the middle to win in general?
Well, I think, I just look at, there was a lot of coming together more than you sometimes realize in these campaigns because there was so much at risk. And so I think Democrats generally saw that and understood, as you said, democracy was important in terms of, being able to do any of the other things you want. If you don't have rule of law, it's very difficult to keep your rights, right? And so I think, that was an undercurrent. But I want to build on what Doug said, because the other observation I had about what was going on in states, and to be honest, I did not get to travel this year as much as I normally do, because I love to be out in the states and really get the feel for what's going on out there. But one of the observations I had was the Democrats in 2018 and in 2020 didn't run the level of field operations that they have in the past. And so, some of that was COVID, they backed off, and then 2020, it hadn't come back as fully. Now this year, I would say truthfully, the volunteers were still getting the dust and the kinks out, and they haven't done some of this for a while. And so it wasn't necessarily an easy thing to get volunteers to go out, but there was a lot of paid efforts, paid canvassing and other things happening in states to turn out that early vote. And I think that was another piece of the factor. And in truth, I kept looking at these numbers going, oh my God, the Republicans have decided they're all going to turn out on election day. And I was like, it scared me very much in terms of democracy and potential violence and those sorts of things. But I was like, wow, if you have bad weather in one place, or you have this or this happen, that is a really risky strategy. And it did not seem as though that was what was going to happen in the end. That was a pretty big hill to overcome. I believe in the end, like in Michigan, the last figures I saw were that it was a Democratic plus 18 with early vote in Michigan. That's a lot to overcome on an election day. And so I think the combination of good candidates running hard. You sometimes have good candidates and they don't run hard. Good candidates running hard, smart campaigns, having a ground game and field operation, and folks truthfully rowing in the boat together more than I have seen at times in the past. I don't know if you agree with that, Doug, but the group seemed to come together. Many folks supported, understanding that we were just right at the margins. And so I saw a lot of unity in the states. I'm not saying that always happened in the national dialogue, but I saw a lot of unity in the states, and I think that's important.
Mr. Chairman, let me ask you about that point about early voting and what a difference that makes, and why is there still this notion within the Republican Party that you shouldn't early vote, and actually encouraging people not to? How do you square that circle?
I don't know what the hell our problem is. Oh my God! I would call up the leadership. I said, "Do you have any idea how we won 63 House seats in 2010?" Our base vote are seniors who live in senior facilities and, private homes where they can't necessarily get out. So getting them their ballots is a core part of our strategy, because that's our vote. And, Donald Trump sits out there in 2020 and basically tells everybody, well, early voting and vote by mail is corrupt. It's like, dude, you just voted by mail in the primary and the general election. Why are you telling our base vote to basically show up on election day? And the cynic in me says that speaks to this sort of narrative to create tensions on the back end. So it's a lot easier to go in and say, look, on election night, we're winning, and then lo and behold, they found all these votes after midnight, and now we're losing. Well, that's because the Republicans in the state changed the state law, so you can't count those votes until after the election's over. So yeah, it's a problem, and it's one the party's going to have to reconcile itself with, because I think what you're going to see in Georgia is just a repeat, of what we saw in 20, and really, it's one of those things that's kind of gotten beyond. I'd be curious if Jerrod, if you're finding this or hearing this, it's actually gone beyond Trump and those in the party who scream that. The base now genuinely feels that these elections, early voting or vote by mail is just verboten. We just don't do it. And it has been a part of the core strategy for Republicans for over 30 years, that, we integrate our get out the vote strategy, our ballot access strategy, all of those things that we would do, certainly our micro-targeting, was all determined by, where our base voters are located and getting the ballot to them, making it easier for them to vote, because we knew a lot of those voters otherwise would not necessarily get to the polls on election day. So to the extent that we could get the ballot in their hand a week, 10 days before they could vote, that's one for the good guys, right? But now we're in this space where all of these things are looked upon suspiciously. People are showing up at drop-off boxes with riot gear on, observing people who are, putting their ballots in the boxes. So we've got to now internally figure out how to change that mindset. Yeah. Because in future cycles, if you get another election where the early ballots are D+18, good luck on election day.
Right. Well, Jerrod, let me bring you in there too. And you also know, might not be good when there's a whole category of candidates called election denier candidates too, right? I mean, what are your thoughts on the chairman's analysis of that?
No, I mean, it's correct in that there should not be a messaging point to hold your vote until election day. I think, and I do think, if you look at, again, the most popular people in Republican politics are going to be the folks, around Brian Kemp and DeSantis and Marco Rubio, because I think they were selling more of a message of, bank those votes, and particularly in Georgia, where there, it was obviously a lot of controversy over, suppressing the vote and people not voting, and they had record numbers. And I do think, somebody like Kemp was pushing the message of, bank your vote, don't hold the vote. And so the people who were successful were more talking about vote, don't hold your vote till election day. So I do think, I think that as we look to 2 years from now, and Republicans want to win, and so I do think that you'll see a shift in the messaging there, and I do think, as you noted on the election denier, I mean, it does look like anybody who made that kind of a central part of their campaign did not win,
right?
And so again, people want to win, and so as we look 2 years from now, I think that you'll see a messaging shift, obviously, on the Republican side.
So if Warnock wins in Georgia, it will have meant that every incumbent senator has been reelected. Is there a power of the incumbency that's there still, and how does Biden factor into that? Because as we talked about at the outset, usually the sitting president's party loses a significant amount of vote in the midterm, and Biden didn't seem to be that much of a drag on tickets. Doug, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, incumbents who run bad campaigns, lose, right? I think we had incumbents, so even if you are an incumbent, that has to translate into running good campaigns. Yeah. And so Raphael Warnock, Mark Kelly, Maggie Hassan, they all ran exceptional campaigns. Cortez Masto, she ran a great campaign, and the people who were around them were professionals who took this very seriously. So yes, there is a power of an incumbency, and I think the last 3 months of the campaign, you had an ability to talk to voters about, actually passing a law that's going to reduce the cost of prescription drugs, and so there were some real things. The law that I don't think we talked enough about, although it was brought up in some of our ads, was the infrastructure bill and how important that was to a lot of states where, whether it was about, water infrastructure or highways. So there were a number of things that were done by Democrats that were really popular in these states, and it was important for those, but you had to talk about it, and you had to invest in telling, in telling those stories about why these things matter to people. And I think Biden, look, in the places where I was working, our candidates were always outperforming Biden, in part because, we got out early to define who, our candidates were. And we knew that it was very important that we had to, run independently of Biden and to some degree the Democratic brand. But the other thing is, the Republican brand wasn't particularly popular either. I mean, in a lot of these places where I was working, the numbers were pretty similar. In fact, the Republicans in Congress had maybe even a lower favorable number than Democrats. So while it was easy to say, well, Biden's approval number was in the low 40s, so Democrats are going to lose all these seats, I think that voters in this election made a decision that, yes, we're not thrilled with Biden's performance, but we're also terrified of this Republican who is running and believe that their views on some of these issues it just makes it so hard for us to support them. And the Democrat has made a compelling case that, look, on the issues that you care about, keeping neighborhoods safe, costs, like they've passed a sort of threshold on that they talked enough about it and made it clear that they actually give a damn about this stuff, that voters decided that, unlike other elections in wave years, that we're going to look past the president here and vote for the person that we think basically shares our values.
I'm curious based on what you just said, Doug, because my analysis comes to a slightly different point. I don't think the Democrats did a great job of telling the American people their story. Democrats spent the first 18 months of the Biden administration fighting amongst themselves over filibuster rules, and the country largely yawned. And you had these events begin to occur external to what the Democrats themselves were doing, that Afghanistan, Supreme Court, that began to drive more of a narrative than anything the Democrats were doing, because the Democrats weren't talking about the success they had. And when they had that week where it just kind of landed, the infrastructure bill, the inflation bill, it was like boom, boom, boom. Even then, it was like a little bit like pulling teeth for the public to sort of make that connection to the Democrats through policy. I don't think policies were a driver in this election. I think at the end of the day, the country settled on, and they bifurcated Biden. They sort of took how they felt about Biden and the economy out of the equation, and they said, you know what, my choice is between the election denier, right, or the non-election denier. My choice is democracy or anti-democracy, which is why it didn't surprise me to see democracy as the #1 issue the weekend before the election, particularly given for those voters, particularly given where we started out in that. So I don't know if this was so much a policy-driven narrative so much. I mean, I get it. You want to pat yourselves on the back about the good things that you were able to get done under difficult circumstances. I'm not begrudging that. But I don't know if that, at the end of the day, people were sitting there going, I really, really love this infrastructure bill. And that's going to carry my vote right through this Tuesday.
No, okay, so just to be clear, I'm not saying that this was based off policy. What I'm saying and what I said was that at the end of the day, the voters chose to support people that they believe shared their values. And ultimately, I think in a lot of these places, these were about these candidates' character. But this larger narrative, that the media narrative, I believe is wrong in terms of, well, Democrats didn't talk about the economy or didn't talk about crime. Most people get their news from local news. And I can tell you, having produced 600 ads this cycle, that we made ads talking about prescription drugs. We made ads talking about costs. We made ads talking about crime. So at a macro level, I do agree with you. I think there were, throughout these last 2 years, it was a lot of sausage making around Build Back Better and all this other stuff. But in these states where these candidates were running super professional campaigns and communicating early, they were talking about those issues. So I think that you almost have to separate what was going on at the national level and what were doing at the national level than what they were doing at the state and district level, where they were able to convince enough voters that, look, we get it, right? And here are some of the things that we're doing. But look, this person over here has some very extreme and dangerous ideas, and they're just and that disqualified them. It made us, we were able to pass a threshold on the things that voters cared about. And so it ultimately became a question of character and values. And I think, and I think on those, and that's where I think Democrats won. But I do think we were talking about some of these issues in a way that maybe weren't seen, at a national level, but at a local level, they certainly were being brought up and discussed. I mean, Tim Ryan, who lost, but, he was talking a lot about manufacturing and jobs in China. And so, yeah, that's what I think, it was an interesting sort of national conversation versus what was going on at the local level.
Yeah. JoDee, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I just want to weigh in on that too. I do think that the national narrative versus what was going on in a lot of states and these congressional districts was different. And that's also where the level of campaign that was being run became part of the challenge, right? So you brought it up, Betsy, around, you saw it in Pennsylvania. What was Mastriano's plan? What was he for, right? And you didn't hear so much of what he was for. And so the Democrats were able to push some of these folks out on the limb, if you will, and start to saw it off because they just wouldn't come in towards the core and think about that. I also think there's still a Trump effect, I believe, with many of the voters in the middle. And they got so tired of watching what was happening nationally or worried what was being posted on Twitter that they still have PTSD from that. And I think they're not happy necessarily with Biden. It's still a place to put some of their anger and frustration. But I also think that made them just look at what's going on around here. This is all I can handle. I can't worry about that national stuff. My God, I don't know if we're ever going to get that right, but I can be a part of what can happen here. And I think that's what I also saw in some of the research we were doing and tracking. And then the last thing, and this is, part of some of the issues we worked on the transgender issues, our community, the LGBTQ community, has had a history of some portion of our community being under attack a lot. It's not a new phenomenon. Our marriages were under attack. We as individuals in the 80s were under attack. This has been a narrative that we have dealt with for a long time. What we see is when more folks know us as individuals, the less likely it is that they're against us. But then there's also a piece of this that we don't really talk about. How many of those Republicans actually had ever met somebody who was transgender, right? So if you're trying to prioritize an issue like that and you're trying to make it an issue, well, how does that become more of an issue in a general election versus inflation or, their job or whatever else it might be? Like, it's only a narrow group of folks. And right now we calculate that to be, we call it ultra mega. We think it's around 15 to 17%. Well, if you're only communicating with that group of people and you need to turn those people out at the end of your election in some of these races, what the heck were you doing all summer and into the fall? I mean, if that's the campaign you're running at the end, holy Toledo, you were really asleep at the wheel. And so, that it's a selfish perspective to some degree in terms of, but we really saw that. And I think, also I do want to say, look, these messages are harmful to kids, and it's particularly focused on kids, which I think is atrocious. They do damage to folks, and I certainly hope we can see a day where that's not the kind of messaging we're going to see coming out of a particular party or a set of candidates. But I think they're totally missing the boat on it, and it's going to come back to bite them in the behind, because in the next 10 years, oh, that's okay, I'll finish this quickly. Right now, LGBTQ people are 8% of the voting that happened in this last election, more than people kind of realize. But if you look ahead to 2030 or 2040, we're going to be 14% in 2030. We're going to be 18% in 2040. That's a voting bloc that is growing, and we have family and friends, and part of how we calculate and capture this is we talk about equality voters, and we message to equality voters, and there are 62 million equality voters in this country. There are a couple million equality voters in Arizona. And so we can message to those folks who are either LGBTQ or our allies. That's how we get to those 3/4 of the people who support our legal equality. Those are going to grow, and youth, 1 in 4, 1 in 5, depending upon which study you look at. So, you know, at some point, I don't know where some of these Republican candidates are going to get their votes. I don't know where they come from.
And young people, they actually voted this cycle. Sometimes we talk about the youth vote and they don't actually show up, and it appears that they did. Jerrod, I'm going to be remiss if I don't ask you about your former boss here, because he's out on a book tour. Made some comments on ABC about Trump's actions being, quote, reckless over January 6th, and Trump decided to be, quote, part of the problem. Give us your thoughts.
Breaking news.
Yeah.
No, it's you know, I worked very closely with Mike Pence, and behind the scenes, in front of the president, I mean, he was as loyal as can be. I mean, never, even if you know, I showed him a tweet or something and said, "Was this really the best thing?" and never took the bait, never ever said anything against the president the entire time I knew him. And so
that's amazing
to see what happened on January 6th. I do think there was a lot of people who were Trump fans and had watched that relationship too. I mean, obviously I was very close to it, and to see that for all the loyalty, you know, that he put in, that it was not reciprocated, obviously, and so I'm not surprised to see his comments, you know, and obviously he's taken some time. You know, Mike Pence is, whatever you say about him, he's very thoughtful, and he's taken the time to kind of unpack all of his thoughts, and I think he's going to be a lot more vocal now, obviously, and so I think that's a good thing, and. But yeah, I mean, he was there with his family. I mean, I was getting texts from, you know, these are Secret Service agents around him, and, you know, staffers who I worked closely with, and then to see that they felt like their lives were in danger, and I mean, those are the kinds of things that, you know, it impacts everybody differently. But when I saw things like that, I mean, you just really feel for him. So, anyways, I mean that. We'll see. I have to read the book. I haven't read it yet.
Well, what do you see as the future for Pence politically? Do you think he'll run for president? What lane is he going to be in? What's your?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be. I think there will be people willing to challenge President Trump. I mean, yeah. President Trump is odds on and the huge favorite right now. I do think, you know, the results of last Tuesday is going to encourage people like Pence, people like DeSantis, to get in. You know, the primaries it's a marathon, and so, you know, I do think in the Republican Party, you are going to have to beat Trump, and that is a lot easier to say, and when you actually get on the stage or go at, you know, it is not easy, and so any of the talk now about, it's, you know, DeSantis versus Trump, I mean, it's not really just going to be DeSantis versus Trump. It's probably not going to be a one-on-one. It's going to be you know, several people involved, and everyone saw how formidable President Trump was in 2016 of, you know, mowing down these 17 other people. So, you know, I do think, you know, I think that people will have to have very targeted ways of going at him state by state. And,
Right.
and someone like DeSantis and Pence and these other, President Trump's run twice now national campaigns. And they need to build national organizations. And DeSantis had this incredible victory and something we haven't touched on. And so I'll just cheerlead here a little bit of like the inroads with the Latino community and the wins in Miami-Dade and just across the board of non-traditional Republican voters. I mean, that is a huge thing that DeSantis did. Now, you have to build a national campaign to do that around the country, and it remains to be seen, who can do that. And President he's done it twice now, and that counts for something.
Yeah. Well, but in many ways, the large field in 2016 helped Trump emerge, right? I mean, the more people that run against him, the better chances he actually has of winning a primary. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it splits the non-Trump vote.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah. Chairman?
Yeah, I agree with that. But here's the end of the day for me. The thing about Trump, having worked with him before politics for him, and observing him in politics, if you're not prepared to confront him as the bully he is politically, then don't even get in the race. Don't pretend. I'm a very strong Mike Pence supporter and admirer, but if the vice president's going to get in the race, he's got to get in the race. He's got to be prepared to stand up and say, you know what, you just need to shut the hell up because you're wrong. And if you're not prepared to do that with Trump, then you're not going to, you go back and look at just go back and if you want to, just for your amusement and enjoyment, watch those debates with those Republicans and watch them each fall.
Yeah.
Because they didn't stand up to, if I'm standing on the stage and you say my wife is ugly, oh baby, we're going to have a conversation. We're going to have a conversation. And it's not going to be one you're going to like. And so unless you're prepared to do that, and I'm not convinced anyone is, which is his superpower. Because everyone says, oh, okay, how do I do this? Well, just get up in his face. If you're not prepared to stand up in his face, then this is not going to go easily for you. A Liz Cheney in that primary, whole different conversation. A Larry Hogan in that primary, a whole different conversation. But the establishment guys, the Marco Rubios, right? With all respect, the Mike Pences, if you haven't shown that quality now, up to now, I don't know when you get to show it, where you're going to just draw that line and go, no, I'm sorry, we're not doing the election 2020 election was stolen, we're not doing any of that. And so that to me is what I'm looking for. Who in the lot, because I'm not convinced DeSantis at the end of the day is necessarily prepared to do that now. Willing to be proven wrong. Same with Mike Pence, willing to be proven wrong. But I just haven't seen anyone up to this point draw that bright line and say, no, we're not doing this anymore. And until someone is, and I think you got to do it before you get on that stage in that first debate, it's going to be interesting to see whether or not this actually plays out. This is going to be just a glide path for Trump.
I don't want to steal any thunder from the 2024 panel. So, midterms are not over. We've got the race in Georgia. So, and we want to take a couple questions from the audience too. But before we do that, let me just go down and get your analysis on where things, how things look right now in Georgia. Doug, you want to start?
I mean, look, I feel pretty good about the runoff. Warnock has a very good campaign, and I do think without the Senate being, at stake, I think that will have an impact on turnout. Now, which side benefits from that is another question, but I do think that, look, Warnock went through this. He's been through this before. He's got a very, very good operation. What I'm hearing about Walker's campaign is essentially he's having to rent Brian Kemp's operation because he really doesn't have one, and at least not one that's professional. And that's a problem. You know, I mean, those folks worked hard for Brian Kemp. They didn't work hard. You know, it's hard to just sort of, you know, pass that down to someone. You know, I mean, so I feel pretty good about Democrats' chances in Georgia and Warnock and winning that.
Jerrod?
Well, I do. I think the smartest things Herschel Walker can do is hold Brian Kemp and DeSantis tight. I mean, you got two very popular governors, both kind of in the media markets that Herschel Walker needs to hit, and you know, lean on them as much as you can, and that's his path to victory. So my hope is you see a lot of DeSantis and Brian Kemp, you know, campaigning with him.
I think that Reverend Warnock has run a really good campaign, and I think he's become an even better candidate. You know, when he first ran, I think he needed to get his rhythm and find his sea legs, but, you know, he had to turn around and run right away again. And so he's already been through, this will be his fourth election, right? So he had 2 elections because he had a runoff before. So he has a lot of that experience under his belt, and I got to see him out there on the trail, and he's in his stride. And so I think he's in his stride, his team is in their stride. I do not see the same thing around Herschel Walker, and I didn't know that he was gonna grab Kemp's you know, field team. I do think he did ride on Kemp's coattails to some degree in this election to get to the runoff, and the last numbers I saw there, it was like 0.6% away from being not a runoff. Yeah, and so you know, I think we're going to see Reverend Warnock win, but it's going to be a vote turnout that the Democrats have to do all over again. But I think folks are pretty fired up to do that.
Chairman?
Yeah, I agree with Jerrod on this one. When it comes to Georgia, the only thing that Herschel Walker can do is rely on the 2 most popular Republican governors in his region, his own governor, Kemp, and Ron DeSantis. I agree with you, JoDee. The idea of sort of taking the infrastructure of another campaign and trying to apply it, I think becomes very, very difficult to do. There's a reason you saw the breakdown in the vote. People voted for Kemp, they did not vote for Walker. I do not know how you turn that part around. And I don't think getting the infrastructure is going to necessarily get you there, you know. So Walker's going to have some work to do. I think advantage Warnock right now. To the extent that you have any additional narratives around, oh, don't early vote, oh, don't vote by mail from Republicans, that's only going to make it more difficult for Herschel Walker in the end to win this. But at this point, you're just playing for status quo ante, right? Because the Democrats are going to control the Senate. So it really, in one sense, which will be interesting to see, what that enthusiasm level is.
Right. Biden's pitch right now is more is better.
Yeah. Well, I think the advantage goes to Biden in making the pitch, because it's better to have 51, and that way you sort of, at least you got a neutral on.
A mansion cushion.
Right, you got a mansion cushion. But for Republicans, I don't know. We want the seat, so what?
Yeah.
Well, and Walker's in a really interesting position because he is Trump's guy, right? Trump handpicked him to run, but now he's embracing, or he's bringing in Kemp, who Trump hates. He's, and DeSantis, who used to be a super Trumper and now is trying to not be. But so how does that, that's going to be an interesting 3 weeks where Walker is going to be, does Trump demand to go campaign there, or does he start, does he create a level of tension within Walker's operation because, look, he wouldn't have run unless Trump said you should run.
Well, if he announces, if Trump seriously announces, but he told us he was very, very, very probably going to do it, so we don't know. We don't know. But if he does, then as an announced candidate for the presidency with this runoff election coming up, you know Trump is going to want to be on the ground in Georgia at some point, which again does not help Walker's cause. So I think the Hill is a big one. My interest in watching this is going to be exactly in terms of how Republicans, how enthusiastic they are going to be, because it's not like this is going to give us control of the Senate.
Right.
It's a very different kind of vibe if it's just for status quo ante.
Yeah. All right, let's take any questions from the group. We have about 5 minutes. Anyone have a question? Oh, we're shy today?
They're shy.
There you go.
Well, I'll start with a question.
Thank you.
Does this work?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. This maybe isn't the right question for the panel specifically, but more getting into the lame duck as now that we have a likely split. Any ideas of how the whole debt limit debate's going to play out? Does McCarthy and McConnell have to bow to some of the more hardliners? Do you think they get a deal on this related to the debt limit? I don't know who follows that the most.
I have an opinion about this. I think that McConnell, well, McCarthy probably more than McConnell, he doesn't want to carry this into the spring, right, and have to deal with this in February, March, April, somewhere in there. He doesn't want to have to worry about it. I think they'll cut a deal and get it done before they leave for Christmas.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think if McConnell was going to be the majority leader, maybe some of there may be a recalculation in terms of, how much they want to allow Democrats to get done during the lame duck. But I think, look, they've got to fund the government and they've got to do debt ceiling. There's probably some tax extenders that they've got to get done. And my sense is that, given that it will likely be, it will definitely be a Senate controlled by Democrats and a House that will likely be controlled by Republicans. It's maybe just better to just get it all done in the next month or two and move on.
Yeah, I'd agree with that too. I think the goal is to try to clear that off the tables as much as possible, particularly given if the Republican House is a narrower majority than the one that they anticipated. There's going to be a lot of internal pressures to do all kinds of things that, they told us they wanted to do, and investigating Joe Biden and doing all these other things. And so the goal is, particularly I think McConnell, I think you're right, is going to drive that more than anything else. Just get it done. We can take this off the plate because we don't want that to get caught up in all the stuff on the back end that could come down the pike a little bit afterwards.
Trump will weigh in too, though, on that and make it extremely difficult for those folks.
Yeah, but if they ignore them, they'll be okay.
Question?
I got a question for anyone and everyone on the panel about our home state of New York. Because surely the only way to paint is what happened is a disaster for Democrats in that state, statewide. You can write off some of that due to the redistricting disaster that ended up happening. But, I wonder if there are any lessons to be learned for Democrats and any opportunities to be realized for Republicans coming out of this big blue state where Democrats did so poorly.
Can I just put my chairman hat on? As New York was always one of those states that I would talk to party officials there. People forget New Yorkers elect Republicans, all right? New Yorkers, are like every other voter out there. You make the case, you can get what you need from them in terms of the vote, and I think that was the case here. I think that on a number of levels and a number of fronts, Republicans made a better argument. You can chalk it off to redistricting. I love how people sort of complain about redistricting today when, one party controlled the House of Representatives for 40 years and no one complained for 40 years. the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives. And so now in each of these cycles, every 10 years you hear all this moaning and groaning about redistricting. Okay, there's some real issues with redistricting that can be dealt with. But I think at the end of the day, you still have to make the case as a party and as candidates, which is important. And I think they did a very effective job of doing that and was able to position the messaging in a way that a lot of New Yorkers are like, okay, and yeah, four House seats, and the governorship was a nail biter for a while there. So the takeaway lesson is you can't slackjaw it. You've gotta stay engaged in the conversation and listen to what the voters are telling you, and not presume, well, we're a Democratic state. Well, no, you're not really. Because you've elected Republican governors and you've elected Republican officials. The Senate at least has gone back and forth between Republicans and Democrats. It's not like Maryland, where Ehrlich and Hogan were kind of outliers, but Hogan kind of stabilized the narrative there in Maryland. Now Republicans, well, up until this cycle, could relatively be a little bit more competitive. So I think there's some really good opportunities for Republicans going forward, particularly when you look at the kind of candidates they can put forward in some of these districts and statewide. And the lesson for Democrats, just because you think it's blue doesn't mean it is.
Yeah, I mean, look, Governor Hochul, won with 54%. I don't know what the final numbers are, but 54%. She did not do particularly well in Long Island districts and suburbs, sort of the suburbs around New York City. And that really hurt, and that's where we lost those seats. And that was really sort of, I don't think it had really anything to do with redistricting. I think, the chairman's right. I think in part it had, I think it's just that, if she had run at 60%, we would have won those places. But I will say the candidates who ran there, Sean Patrick Maloney ran a really good campaign. He was facing a barrage of outside money spending against him. He waved off allied groups so that they didn't have to spend for him. And in some ways he was sort of, he took I think the speaker said it, an arrow for the party. But he ran a really good campaign, and several of the other Democrats, they all took it seriously. But when you have quite frankly, I think just that, Governor Hochul was not as strong as she needed to be at the top of the ticket. And even Schumer's numbers weren't historically Schumer's numbers, right? So, and I think there was definitely something around this issue of cash bail that was featured in almost every negative ad against Democrats, whether or not they were part of the assembly or not. That was front and center in all of these, these campaigns, and crime was an important issue. And even though Democrats talked about it, it was something that, I think, for Republicans, they were able to really make this case that full party rule in Albany was resulting in some of these things that made us less safe. And I think that was whether that's true or not, I think it was a message that they just were pounding away at in these districts. And it ultimately they lost by very thin margins. But I do think I think if the governor had been a little bit stronger in some of those places, probably would have pulled it out.
Yeah, Doug made the point earlier, but it's campaigns and candidates matter, and I think that, we've been talking a lot about where it hurt Republicans. I think this is the exact point where it helped, and it was a focused campaign, it seemed like, across the board of targeting on crime and not getting it to some of these other issues that we've been real critical of today. And it was, it kept it on an issue that voters ultimately did care about. I do think that, as I mentioned earlier, Dobbs probably didn't have as big of effect as you probably saw in places like Michigan and some of these other, Pennsylvania. And so, Lee Zeldin seemed like he was very focused, and even though he came up short, was able to, he did have coattails enough in these areas, and everybody was on, the right message points. So.
All right, well, appropriately, we're going to leave it and end on New York, since this is NYU after all. More to come, though. Our next panel, panel 2, is going to be polling and media coverage of the 2022 midterms. So we will see you all at our next panel starting shortly. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thanks to this panel.
Thank you.
Yes.